Greece in 2004, Montpellier in 2012, Leicester in 2016, Crystal Palace knocked out of the FA Cup by a 6th Division English club in 2026. All of these events have one thing in common. They were considered almost impossible. In no other major sport does this kind of scenario happen so frequently. In football, objectively weaker teams beat opponents that are richer, stronger, and more experienced. And sometimes they even go all the way. Football gives the impression of being a sport where the best team doesn't always win, a sport dominated by the unexpected, by mistakes, sometimes even by randomness, which gives it the feeling of being unpredictable. But is it just an impression, or is football by nature the most unpredictable sport in the world? That's what we're going to try to understand in this video. To try to understand this feeling of unpredictability, we first need to look at what the numbers actually say. To do that, we'll rely on a study published by The Athletic in September 2025, which examined a very simple question: how often does the favorite actually win in professional sports? The analysis is based on bookmakers' odds since 2005 across several major sports and on thousands of matches and competitions. The goal isn't to see who wins the most often, but to measure the gap between what probabilities predict before a match and what actually happens on the field. In other words, when the numbers say that a team or a player is the favorite, how often does that status really hold up in reality? And the results are very revealing. In men's tennis at Grand Slam tournaments, the favorite wins about 76% of the time. In women's tennis, the figure is slightly lower, but still very high at around 72%. In the NBA and the NFL, the observation is similar. On average, the favorite wins about 2 games out of 3. Then comes Major League Baseball and finally football. In the Premier League between 2005 and 2025, the favorite wins only 52% of the time. That means that in nearly 1 match out of 2, the final result does not match what the probabilities predicted before kickoff. The gap is huge. No other major team sport shows such a high level of uncertainty in a single match. Football stands out very clearly, not because of a few exceptional seasons or isolated upsets, but consistently over a 20-year period. This first finding is fundamental. Football is not unpredictable because of perception or exaggeration. It is statistically unpredictable. So the real question is no longer whether football is unpredictable, but why it is so unpredictable, and above all, why it is more unpredictable than other sports. And to understand why football is more unpredictable, we first need to focus on a fundamental distinction: the difference between individual sports and team sports. In an individual sport, performance depends almost entirely on a single actor. There are no complex interactions to manage, no coordination to maintain between several players. If the best athlete performs at their level, they win most of the time. Tennis is the clearest example. And if there is one player who embodies individual dominance, it is Novak Djokovic. To this day, Djokovic has won 24 Grand Slam titles, an absolute record in the history of tennis. Over his career, he has played more than 1,330 professional matches and won 84% of them. A colossal figure, with almost no equivalent across all sports. But what is even more interesting is what lies behind that dominance. Across all those matches, Djokovic has won only 54% of the points he has played. In other words, even the most decorated player in tennis history wins just over 1 point out of 2. And yet, he wins the vast majority of his matches. This is explained by a key characteristic of individual sports: the existence of clearly identifiable decisive moments. In tennis, not all points carry the same weight. Some are insignificant, others are crucial. And it is those points that the very best players control better than anyone else. Most importantly, in an individual sport, there is only one main variable: the player themselves. They do not depend on a teammate, on collective positioning, or on someone else's mistake. In team sports, the logic is completely different. Performance is no longer the sum of individual talents, but the result of constant interactions between several players. In football, there are 11 players on the pitch, 11 different profiles, 11 decision makers, 11 ways of reacting under pressure. Even if a team is superior overall, it can be put in trouble by a single individual mistake, poor coordination, bad positioning, or a defensive hesitation. And unlike in tennis, those mistakes cannot always be compensated for immediately. A defender who slips, a goalkeeper who misjudges a situation, and the entire collective plan can collapse in a fraction of a second. This is where football begins to stand apart. In a team sport, the more interactions there are, the more potential breaking points exist. And the more breaking points there are, the greater the uncertainty. The outcome no longer depends solely on a team's overall level, but on its ability to maintain near-perfect coordination throughout an entire match. It is this accumulation of human variables that makes football naturally more uncertain than an individual sport. But this explanation alone is not enough, because other team sports like basketball or American football remain far more predictable than football. So we need to go further and look not only at the players, but at the very rules of the game, because that is where football truly becomes unique. The first unique aspect of football comes down to something very simple: the number of possible outcomes. In most major team sports, a match ends with a win or a loss. There is no middle ground. In basketball, draws do not exist. The same goes for baseball. In American football, draws are extremely rare, only 30 over the last 51 NFL seasons. In football, however, 3 outcomes are possible: a win, a loss, and a draw. This detail fundamentally changes the logic of the game. The draw offers an additional option to weaker teams. They do not need to win to achieve their objective. They can simply resist. A draw can be perfectly rational, deliberately accepted, and sometimes even actively sought. In no other major team sport can not winning already be considered a positive result. That is a specificity of football, and it is the first opening through which unpredictability enters the game. But this unpredictability doesn't stop there. It is amplified by another fundamental characteristic of football: the low number of goals. In the 5 major European leagues, an average of only 2 to 3 goals are scored per match. Compared to other major team sports, the gap is enormous. In basketball, a game is decided by hundreds of cumulative points. In American football, by several dozen. This difference has a very simple mathematical consequence. The fewer decisive events there are, the more weight each one carries in the final result. If you lose possession in basketball, you might concede a basket, but you will have many opportunities to recover. In football, a single action can be enough to decide a match. And unlike high-scoring sports, these mistakes cannot always be compensated for. That's why in football, a team can dominate for 90 minutes, create dozens of chances, and still lose from a single shot on target. We all have examples in mind. In this sport, one single mistake can have major consequences. And this fragility of the result is reinforced by another fundamental characteristic of football. In this sport, a goal is a goal, no matter the distance, the difficulty, or the moment of the match. A shot from 50 meters is worth exactly the same as a one-on-one from 6 meters. An own goal is worth exactly the same as a perfectly placed shot into the top corner. Football makes no distinction between types of goals. In most other major team sports, this is not the case. In basketball, not all baskets have the same value. They can be worth 1 point, 2 points, or 3 points. In American football, a touchdown is worth 6 points, a field goal only 3, and after a touchdown, it is still possible to add 1 or 2 extra points. Even in baseball, a single play can be worth 1 to 4 runs, depending on the situation. These systems have a very clear effect. They allow dominant teams to convert their superiority into a larger scoreline. In football, this amplification does not exist. A team can dominate territorially, technically, and statistically without ever pulling away on the scoreboard. And as long as the margin is only 1 goal, it is never safe. That is why, in this sport, a dominant team remains vulnerable until the very last second, and this vulnerability becomes even more visible once it concedes the opening goal. Because in football, scoring first radically changes the shape of a match. The numbers show this very clearly. In the Premier League, the team that scores first wins or draws in 8 out of 10 cases. In other words, once the advantage is taken, the priority is no longer to attack but to protect that goal, and football offers every tool to do exactly that. First, the low block, parking the bus in front of the goal and forcing the opponent to take long-range shots which are far harder to convert. Then, game management. Unlike sports such as basketball or American football, the clock does not stop at every interruption. It is therefore possible to break the rhythm and slow down restarts. On average in Europe, effective playing time is around 58 minutes, far from the 90 minutes shown on the clock. Even with added time, all this lost time is never fully recovered, a factor that further strengthens the advantage of the team in front. As a result, football rewards game management once ahead, not continuous domination. After taking the lead, it becomes rational to stop taking risks, close the game down, and wait for the opponent to make a mistake. It is this combination of factors that makes football so hard to control, and therefore so unpredictable. But within all of this, there is one sport that goes even further in uncertainty, where predicting a winner is even more complex than in football. And that sport, quite surprisingly, is an individual one: golf. If we look at PGA Tour data, the finding is striking. In major professional tournaments, the favorite wins only about 10% of the time. That is even less than in football. The reason is simple. In golf, there is not one opponent to beat, but sometimes more than 100. The favorite does not just have to be better than a direct rival, but better than everyone else over several days of competition. On top of that come other variables that are impossible to control. The weather can change from one day to the next, or even from 1 hour to another. Tee times are not the same for everyone, meaning some players face the course in radically different conditions. And unlike team sports, the playing field itself changes from tournament to tournament. Even the greatest champions are not immune to this logic. Tiger Woods, despite being considered one of the most dominant golfers in history, won only around 22% of the professional tournaments he played. An exceptional figure for golf, but one that shows just how uncertain victory remains, even for the very best. In the end, golf is probably the most unpredictable sport in the world if we look purely at the ability to predict a winner. But as soon as we return to sports where two teams face each other directly, football remains a special case. Everything in its very structure favors uncertainty. In the end, football does not stand out because the favorite never wins. It stands out because the favorite does not win as often as we might expect. Every week in every league, we see teams that are theoretically superior draw or lose. Over the course of a season, the objective is therefore not only to win matches, but above all, to lose as few as possible. That ability is often what makes the difference in the standings, far more than pure dominance. And that is probably what makes football so unique. So tell me, do you think football is one of the hardest sports to predict? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, boost it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. Thanks for watching, and see you very soon.